Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, February 4th, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,400 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story skyscraper that collapsed suddenly, symmetrically, into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. This at 5:20 p.m. in the afternoon of September 11th. Before we go further, though, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Mr. Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I am here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. Best way to submit them to us is go to ae911truth.org, and you'll see right up at the top, it says continuing education, and you select the live webinars. There's a box you can type them right in. I'll definitely see your questions there. But I'll also be looking at our YouTube broadcast of this webinar as well as the Facebook one to look for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard's going to be presenting. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects and engineers and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So with all that behind us, let's jump into it. World Trade Center Building 7. Did you even know that a third tower collapsed on 9/11? I didn't until somebody told me about it, listening to a radio program in 2006. Even still, today, most architects and engineers know nothing about the third worst structural failure in modern history, and that after the Twin Towers. Yeah, we're talking about World Trade Center Building 7. You know, the American Institute of Architects never even issued one bulletin on this incredible, historic, high-rise collapse that was unprecedented, as you'll see. It's 47 stories tall, easily be the tallest building in most of our states. And Emery Roth and Sons was the architect of record, the structural engineer, Irwin Cantor. It was part of the World Trade Center complex, as you see here, and just outside the super block of the World Trade Center, but part of the World Trade Center nevertheless. It was about 300 feet north of the North Tower. And it was not hit by an airplane, and yet it came down, and we'll be looking at that quite a bit today. So here it is standing just fine before the collapse of the Twin Towers, and then we have the collapse of the Twin Towers that morning, and you can see the building is still standing just fine. In fact, some of the debris did hit the building, and there were some fires that started. And those fires are said to be the cause of this building's collapse. So by official sources, we're going to challenge that hypothesis today. And some of the beams that were expelled from the North Tower did hit the Building 7. But these are said to not have been a significant factor in the cause of this building's collapse. We'll find out what was First, let's look at the building collapse itself. Here we have the east penthouse going to be falling first, as you see, and then about 6 seconds later, the entire building starts a symmetrical free fall collapse straight down into its own footprint. Let's talk about the cause of this building's collapse from official sources. Here, Shyam Sundar of the NIST agency, the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Okay, well, if it's due to fires, we should be looking at these fires. They're, as you can see by this video compilation of the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in this building. Let's see, we'll go through them. And yeah, that's about it. No, here's some more fires. And those are seen here also. And those are indeed the worst fires that we have evidence of. So what does all this mean? Well, here are the fires on the east side of the building, burning about 2:30 p.m. They move over to the north side, and by 3 p.m. They've moved off to the east end of the building. Interesting. I want to double check that. But the final report on the collapse of this building, produced by NIST, does cite some of the damage, as you see down here, but they focus their collapse initiation theory on column 79, because that's underneath the east penthouse, which did collapse first. So they levy an argument in favor of the fire collapse theory by creating their fire simulation. And that fire simulation, let's look at it in some detail here. Oops. There we go. At 2 p.m., we have fires on the south side. They do move over to the east side at about 3 p.m. And then by 4 p.m., they're hovering around column 79. Now, they also have them still hovering around 5 p.m. The collapse is at 5:20. So for over an hour and a half or so, they have these fires in the area of column 79. Now, that directly contradicts the understanding of fire protection engineers and NIST itself, which says such fires did not persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. Well, why then do they have those fires persisting in this location for an hour and a half between 3 and 5:20 p.m.? Because they need those fires to be persisting according to their collapse initiation theory. But the photographs actually show that those fires were burned out on this floor, the 12th and 13th floor, which NIST focuses their collapse initiation theory on. Relative to those fires moved over, as you can see, toward the east. Excuse me, from east to west. East on the left, west on the right. So more accurate to the photographs that we see in the middle of the building, we have a fire simulation that we produced that shows on the east, those fires are burning about 2 p.m. and they move over about 3 p.m. to the north east side, but they've moved on by 4 p.m. So for an hour and a half before the collapse of this building, those fires are gone from the column 79 area. And that's absolutely critical to understand, because that being true, NIST's collapse initiation theory, which focuses on what these fires actually did during that hour and a half, and specifically the few minutes prior to the collapse of that building, could never have happened. Let's go back to Shyam Sunder of NIST.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse. And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
Well, that's the official story in a nutshell there. Let's break it down first. We have NIST saying that these columns expanded due to those fires, which they claim were active in this area for an hour and a half prior to the collapse of the building. Expanding these beams, pushing this girder off of its seat on this column 79, which causes floor 13 to fall on 12, 12 on 11, and so on for 9 floors until the entire verticality of this column from this floor 13 all the way up to the roof has collapsed due to unsupported length exceeding 9 floors. Well, none of that could have happened for about a dozen reasons, which I'll tell you right now. First, we have fireproofing on these beams. They could not have expanded. The fireproofing is 2-hour fire protection on these beams. That's a lot longer than any fire, even according to NIST, could have burned in this area. You can see the fire protection partially installed in this construction progress photo. So second of all, they had to put all that fire, all that heat, 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, into that beam in a second and a half in their computer model in order to get it to expand this beam. That's unrealistic. Fires take longer than a second and a half to heat up, don't they? So that would have forced them to expand rather than sag, which, as you'll see in a moment, is what we would expect and what tests have proven to show that beams do when they're heated up. Third, even if that beam could have expanded, pushing this girder off of its seat, the girder would not have been pushed off. Why? Because there are 30 shear studs tying that girder, as shown in the shop drawings, which means that the slab, the concrete slab up above it, is composite with that beam. That beam cannot slide with it being pinned every couple of feet or so to the concrete slab. So that girder never could have slid off of its seat. Third, even if those shear studs weren't there, the stiffeners that you see right in the center on top of the flange would, well, let's take a step back. This girder would have had to have been pushed all 12 inches off of its seat. But NIST says, no, that's not true. It only had to be pushed halfway off of its seat. Why? Because the flange, the bottom horizontal member, would have folded after the vertical member past the end of the 12-inch wide steel angle beam seat. So, that's intuitive, except for one thing. They also had to omit, in order to get that to happen, the shop drawings, which show 3/4 inch steel stiffeners welded to support not only the web, the vertical section here shown in elevation, but the flange of that girder here shown in plan. So those stiffeners were there, and they would have kept that flange from ever folding. But even if that were true, we have another problem for NIST. Let's say that let's say that stiffener wasn't a problem for NIST. Even so, you couldn't have had the second floor, the 13th floor falling on the 12th here, even if that did fall off of its seat, that girder, because there's two other major girders that are intact on that column that would have kept that floor from ever falling. But even if it did fall, we would have had a real problem for NIST also, because it only had 1/10 of the dynamic force that it needed to break the connections below on those three girders, which would have been 632,000 pounds, but there's only 60,000 pounds available. So NIST has done very sloppy work here, to say the least. But let's see how bad it actually is. Here's their computer animation.
Here's our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
Well, you have 400 structural steel connections failing every second. And then as the building begins to tip over, it stops. They don't even show you the rest of it. It stops after 2 seconds, 2 seconds after the global collapse. Let's look at it compared to the actual video of the collapse of this building. The east penthouse is shown fairly accurately, except you would have had massive breaking up of granite panels and windows, if anything like what you see in this computer model actually happened. But we don't see that, do we? In the actual video, there's maybe a dozen windows broken up way down here. But look, we have incredible quantities of not only what would have been breaking of windows and granite panels, but buckling of the interior, buckling of the exterior steel perimeter structural system, because the inside is collapsing. It would be pulling that in. And in fact, that's exactly what their computer model does show, contrary to the actual video of the collapse. So we have some major problems with the integrity of NIST here. So we've submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, which you can do with agencies like NIST that commit fraud, such as we're seeing here. They've denied the request, citing, well, gosh, that would jeopardize public safety. That's their only legal out for withholding information under the Freedom of Information Act. Well, gosh, wouldn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold this information from the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? After all, if buildings like this went down due to a few small scattered fires that we saw that were much smaller and less longer lasting than fires in steel skyscrapers that you'll see in a moment, then we have a major problem in this country. And it should be the most studied building failure in history. Remember, no plane hit this building. We're talking about fires only. So that's why we use the scientific method. In the West, we've had it for 100 years or so. At AE 911 Truth, we've had it for about 14. We got up to speed really quickly, and here's what we found. This is how you winnow error from truth, by the way, fact from fiction, reality from fantasy. You have a question. How did the building come down? You do some background research. How have other buildings come down? And make observations. You construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess. I think this building came down by fire. That's a reasonable hypothesis that it had fires in it. And explosions and controlled demolition, another reasonable hypothesis, completely overlooked by NIST. But we lay out, because what we do is we lay out all the hypotheses that make rational sense. Like, as you'll see at the end of this, by the end of this presentation, this hypothesis of controlled demolition does. But we don't, using the scientific method, we don't favor one hypothesis over another due to our financial or political or career obligations that might sway our objective opinion in a matter such as this. We test those hypotheses with experiments after making predictions about them. We analyze the results, we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're about. Very reasonable. And we don't hide the computer data from the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety, for instance. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, as we'll see today, that it has not been by NIST, the hypothesis of fire bringing these buildings down, we go back and we construct a new hypothesis, which is what we're doing today. And until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence. So with that in mind, let's do some background research. Let's look at how buildings have come down historically. What are the forces that have been active? Well, fire's certainly one of them. Fire is an organic process. It's chaotic with high temperatures. It burns out an area in roughly 20 minutes or so, moving on then, looking for fresh new combustibles, fuel sources. And again, as NIST even admitted in its report, the fires didn't persist for more than a half an hour, which completely invalidates their hypothesis based on their fire simulation, which we showed. Also, skyscrapers don't collapse. We haven't lost a steel frame fireproof skyscraper ever, and we've had 100 years of tests with many fires in them. But say in wood frame buildings, in which the structure itself is combustible, lower height wood frame buildings would fall over to the path of least resistance in halting stages, if you will. It's a chaotic process following the laws of entropy, increasing disintegration of order. Now, we did have a test to find out what would happen in steel frame buildings. In this case, Cardington, UK, 1995, they built an 8-story building out of steel, some of which was fireproofed and some of which was not, as you see in the ceiling of this building. And they lit it on fire. Let's see what happened.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to essentially fire. And of course, airplane impacts in the case of the Twin Towers, which we'll get to next week and the week following on Thursdays during February at this same time in this 3-part series, 9/11 and Architect's Guide. But this building is inherently stable because of the steel construction. It's highly redundant, very robustly built. So even as you see here, also, the steel did not fail. It warped. We'd expect that in temperatures exceeding 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. but there's no failure. Certainly the connections did not fail. So compare that to the connections failing in NIST's computer model at a rate of 400 per second from top to bottom throughout that building in its 7-second collapse. Completely unrealistic. Well, let's look at what is realistic for fires in high-rise buildings.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, none of them did. Not even after 9/11, with these 3 fully engulfed buildings that did not collapse either. So let's look at some buildings that did collapse, like in this case, earthquakes caused these collapses, which we'll call natural collapses. But the building falls over to the path of least resistance after damage is done down low. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not turned to powder. We see and recognize a building as a building in the aftermath. And we'll compare these features to, alternatively, what happened to Building 7. But first, these buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized building materials expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the ignition of very hot gases from the explosives. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know darn well that you have explosions. We will compare these features to what happened in Building 7. As we will these features where explosions can be harnessed quite effectively in order to bring down tall buildings very, very efficiently, like you see here. What they do is place shaped cutter charges against the columns and beams throughout the building and then detonate them in a very precise order, bringing the building usually down according to a set of features which are very recognizable. In fact, let's look at them. We have a sudden onset of destruction. Usually that's at the base of the structure. We have a straight down symmetrical collapse, usually, into the building's footprint. We have a patterned, that's because we have a patterned removal of column supports. That's how you create the symmetry, resulting in a free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure in the building. And therefore we have the total dismemberment of that structural steel frame as well. We have limited damage to adjacent structures, feature number 6. That's one of the goals of controlled demolition. We have explosions that are heard by witnesses, flashes of light that are seen by them. We have broken up concrete floors or powdered concrete sometimes. Well, usually they're just broken up in normal controlled demolitions. We'll see what happens in building 7. And we have explosive charges visible at many of the floors. These are squibs, isolated explosive ejections, clearly evidence of explosion. We have chemical evidence left behind in the residue of explosive devices. If you have these features, you can be darn sure that you have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically, as we talked about, and with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony and eyewitness evidence and eyewitness testimony, we have government documentation that can be very helpful in determining what might be an explosion. You don't just go and bring down a building like this in an afternoon. You have to have months of preparation and government approvals, typically, with a building like this. You have foreknowledge, therefore, of the destruction by people who know in advance. We'll see that with regard to building 7. We'll see experts agreeing. Yeah, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter. Of course, with video documentation, like you're already starting to see here, we have proof, therefore, of controlled demolition. So with that body of proof in mind, we want to apply it to building 7. Let's start with feature number 1. Is there a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure? Well, let's watch and listen to Dan Rather on CBS give his accounting of this building's collapse.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What? Deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Well, that's Dan Rather using his own intuition. We've all seen the hotels in Las Vegas, for instance, and yes, this looks exactly like that. Or they just come down uniformly, symmetrically, rapidly. And but we never heard Dan talking about this since 9/11. In fact, with 2 exceptions on national mainstream television, we haven't seen this, the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history, shown on television. The 9/11 Commission report, in its 571 tome of 9/11, didn't even mention the collapse of this 3rd skyscraper. A real sweeping under the rug here, and we're going to find out why today as we look at feature number 2. Is there a straight down symmetrical collapse? Well, let's go to West Street and see this building's collapse. Yeah, pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Interesting. Now, watch the east penthouse on the left has already come down. This is the overall collapse 7 seconds later. Now, watch what's left here is the central screen wall and the west penthouse. A half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building, that entire structural system has collapsed. Now, what does that mean? What NIST had told us is that the collapse started at the east penthouse and then worked its way slowly across this building. Well, in about 10 seconds or so, they say, across this football field sized building, which is actually rather rapidly, but much slower than what you see here, which is an instantaneous collapse of the central part of this building. Why? Well, the column support underneath it must have given way all at once, instantaneously. That's what they do in controlled demolitions. They take out the core first, and then a half a second or a second or so later, the entire building comes down. And that's what you see here. This is not in conformance with the NIST hypothesis, their initiation of collapse hypothesis. And does it fall into its own footprint? Yeah, pretty much. The center of the building is in the center of the footprint. Now, you might not be convinced yet. Let's put a controlled demolition on the right, series of different ones, and building 7 on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like all these controlled demolitions, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a steel frame skyscraper, fireproofed, ever before. Should it not have been the first hypothesis that NIST looked at as the most credible hypothesis out there? But no, it was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions, which NIST only published many years later, 10 years later, after 9/11. So what do they say? The question, did investigators consider the possibility that an explosion caused or contributed to the collapse of World Trade Center 7? What do they say? NIST concluded that the blast events inside the building did not occur. No blast events. It found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast event. We'll find out that they never looked for it either later. The smallest blast capable of falling the building's critical column, 79, would have resulted in a sound level of 130 decibels. Well, high-energy explosives produce very loud bangs. But something else that's capable of bringing this building doesn't produce that level of noise. Well, look at that. Yet, this building was brought down, according to NIST, by these fires symmetrically. Well, how does that happen? How do you bring a building down symmetrically? You have to remove all the core columns at once, followed a second or so later by the perimeter columns. Any deviation in that pattern, and the building will begin to tip and fall to the path of least resistance. Do fires have that level of precision? These fires? We have to think critically. We can't just swallow what we're told by authorities anymore. Those days are done. Feature number 4. Is there a free fall acceleration? Well, let's go to David Chandler, physics teacher, and learn what this is all about.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Zero resistance?
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
And that's exhibited in the structural manuals themselves for steel structures. There's always, even after a column buckles, you might call that breaking, but they don't actually break, they bend. Even after they bend, they never give up all of their resistance. They maintain 25% of their resistance even under the most extreme failures. And yet NIST acknowledges that this building came down at free fall, which means not one of those 80 columns gave any resistance. That is the definition of free fall. And in free fall for a third of this building's 7-second collapse. Feature number 5, is there the total dismemberment of the steel frame? Well, we have a 47-story skyscraper, which is a moment-resisting steel frame structure where the columns and the beams are very rigidly welded to each other, so they might bend a little bit, but they don't break. But what you have here is a 47-story moment-resisting skyscraper that's been disintegrated to 6 stories. A house of cards, basically. What happened to all those column and beam connections? Thousands of them. Remember, buildings that fall by natural forces don't, the columns and beams aren't severed one from another. The building is recognizable as a building. Is there limited damage to adjacent structures? Well, yeah, pretty limited damage. The center of this building is in the center of the pile. There's minor damage to the adjacent buildings, though. Where there's sounds of explosions heard by witnesses. Well, listen to NIST about this one first.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse, nor reported by witnesses.
But let's see what sounds those witnesses nearby did hear that NIST did not choose to interview. Like this witness, the afternoon of 9/11, right after the building collapse, interviewed on 1010 Winds Radio in New York.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then about a second later, the bottom floor caves out.
A shock wave ripping through the building, a sound of a clap of thunder, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. What does that sound like? How about this witness, Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 boom. Like like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
And this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who was working for the Department of Housing, and he and Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, were attempting to go back into the building, not realizing that it had been evacuated already. And I guess they got to work late that day. And they're trying to make their way up into the building. And they did. They actually got to the 23rd floor, but then they realized that we better get out of here. So here they've come down to the 8th floor, and this is what happens to him.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions. You know?
What's the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, the police officer comes to me and says, "You have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run."
Bombs? Like these bombs heard by these first responders in the late morning of 9/11 in the area of Building 7?
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay. All right. Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
We're told by NIST that these sounds are the sounds of one floor falling on another, but the towers had already come down by this time, and the Building 7 did not, which was obvious, but Building 7 did not come down yet because, of course, that was in the afternoon. Well, the official narrative tells us that the seismic waves that were recorded were a result of the collapse of Building 7. Is that true? Let's look carefully here. We have the seismic signal at 5:20 and 42 seconds. The peak seismic signal here. Okay. But the start of the building collapse doesn't happen until 10 seconds later. So how can the building collapse cause a seismic signal 10 seconds earlier? Well, NIST has a reason for this. This is likely due to the falling of debris from the collapse. What they mean is the interior of the collapse, which they say did collapse about 10 seconds earlier. Well, we found that that wasn't true. We found that the east penthouse collapses 7 seconds earlier, but there's no breaking of windows below, so it appears to be an isolated event, and that's proven, as we'll talk about. And the interior of the collapse did not proceed until only a half a second prior to the overall collapse. We saw that also. So NIST is caught lying yet again. The fraud never ends with this agency. This cover-up, which is all you can call NIST's work here, is further undermined by applied geophysics expert Andre Rousseau in 2009 and 2012. What does he say? Seismic data, according to the seismic data, the bell-like form points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. So these seismic signals undeniably have an explosive origin. Well, let's go on. Feature number 8. The pyroclastic-like clouds, in other words, incredible heat produced here in this collapse. Let's go to the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigations. NIST actually had a hand in creating this document, so they should have been adept at following it, but they didn't. What does it say? Look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical reactions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, that's exactly what we have, racing in every direction away from the collapse of Building 7 at 35 miles an hour. Rapidly expanding plumes in cauliflower-shaped formations. Is there enough heat to create this extremely rapid expansion in these small fires, which were probably extinguished during the collapse of the building itself? No, we're looking for something much greater in terms of heat. Something on the order of this. And we find it. As we look for the evidence of that heat, we start with the NASA air flights, with their infrared sensitive cameras, mapping the thermal sites. At Building 7 here, we have 1,340 degree temperatures Fahrenheit on the surface. Well, how do we get temperatures that high on the surface? These are temperatures associated with the extreme hottest office fires. But there's no office fire on the surface. So what are they measuring? They're measuring something that surely must have been much hotter, deeper down in the bottom of the pile, which, when radiating and diffusing that heat at the surface of the pile, cooled off to 1,340 degrees. Let's look for evidence of what that could have been. Here's Abul Hasan Astani Azal, a structural engineer, given access by the National Science Foundation to the Fresh Kills landfill.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center. Well, wait a minute. Girders do not melt in office fires, but they did melt here, and this is what he's talking about. He's documenting the melting of this girder. But he doesn't know how it could have been done. He says steel members in the debris pile, a different engineer, fire protection engineer Jonathan Barnett, steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Now, there's a problem here. Steel doesn't evaporate until about 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Which is at least 4 times, probably 5 times the temperature that office fires ever get to be. 500 to 1,000 degrees typically. And FEMA, in their Building Performance Assessment Team report, which came out in May of 2002, before the NIST report, in Appendix C, they put the metallurgical examination of this steel. Thank God, because what does it document? Never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like you see here in this piece of World Trade Center steel. They document rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron, that's molten iron, sulfur, hot corrosion attack on the steel. The New York Times says this is perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. And yet, this information and report was completely omitted from the final report when NIST took over the investigation from FEMA. The entire metallurgical report abandoned. NIST says, well, we couldn't test the steel. No steel has been identified from Building 7, but you just saw two pieces that were, right? You saw the reports that were based on one of those pieces. The report. No steel recovered from the site. They just want this to go away, this problem which they cannot explain, not even remotely possible given the official account of this event. And yet, here is John Gross on the pile, photographed with this very piece of steel that had the hot temperature corrosion attack. So he clearly knew about it. His shadow is all over the evidence. And yet they took it out of their final report and the draft report. Well, the fires might have been 1,200 degrees, according to Thomas Eiger, Fahrenheit. Structural steel doesn't even melt until almost 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. What can create the difference between office fires and steel melting or evaporating? Well, we'll be looking at thermite, a possible suspect, in a moment. But even jet fuel doesn't even burn, and no plane hit this building, but we get to this when we get to the Twin Towers. Jet fuel only burns 600 degrees Fahrenheit. And some people say 1,400 degrees for hydrocarbons in buildings. So collectively, 600 to 1,400 degrees. Yet steel had definitely melted. In fact, we can see by the liquid molten material falling out of the claws of this crab claw excavator, because we know the temperature of molten metals when by their color. That's just the physics of molten materials. So we have here evidence of 2,500 degrees with the yellow, and it's even hotter than that with the white hot below. 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, documented temperatures here. So what caused all of this steel to melt? Let's look at thermite. And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, it would explain the extreme heat, 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It would also explain the molten iron, elemental iron. We haven't used iron in our structural skyscrapers for 100 years or so. And we'll find lots of evidence for iron, elemental iron, molten elemental iron coming up in a moment. But it would also explain the presence of sulfur, which you just saw was added to thermite to become thermate. Much more effective at cutting through steel. But were these investigation regulations and guides followed by NIST? Because it says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. Well, Catherine Fletcher says in writing, NIST found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. But a year later, when pressed, she says NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't test for. This is disingenuous at best and fraud more likely. But others looked for it, and it wasn't that hard to find. Here's Stephen Jones, nuclear physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, who is sent a piece of material from this sculpture by the sculptor from the International Peace Park in Canada. First, he notes, looking at the steel itself, that, gosh, office fires don't do this to steel. This is a very jagged cut. I mean, this is not what thermal lances and oxyacetylene torches are capable of doing with these steel beams, as you see this one cut by an iron worker. No, something much different is going on with some of these steel beams. So he does X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy of this piece of slag from the end of the steel beam. And what does he find? Well, the ingredients of ignited thermite, which is found in the iron, elemental iron, and the aluminum oxide here, but also sulfur. So sulfur is confirmed here, which means thermate, along with potassium, manganese. We'll get to the importance of that in a moment. But let's look and see what official sources have found in the World Trade Center dust, in this case, the U.S. Geological Survey, who analyzed the dust very meticulously in 2005, producing their report, World Particle Atlas of the World Trade Center dust, in which they find billions of previously molten iron microspheres. Now that's a mouthful. Let's unpack it. First of all, they're spherical, which means they were previously molten. They're about 1/16 of an inch long, the largest of them. Most of them are almost naked to the human eye, but they're in all the samples. They're iron, not steel. Elemental iron. Again, where did the iron come from? These are, we haven't built skyscrapers out of elemental iron for 100 years, as I mentioned. They comprise up to 6% of the dust in these samples, amounting by extrapolation up to 4 tons altogether. 4 tons of previously molten iron microspheres. They're not iron particles that are found in common office building dust. R.J. Lee Group, an environmental engineering group, also did their own analysis, and they find that these are formed during the event. They don't know where they came from. Neither does the USGS. They simply document that they're there and make a conclusion that they're formed during the event, not before by the welders that welded the steel, not after by the iron workers taking the steel apart, but during the event. But they don't know how. There are so many of them that they're used as a signature to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. Well, where would they come from? let's put together a thermite experiment and see if thermite produces them. Here's a small experiment produced by Stephen Jones, formerly with professor with Brigham Young University, a nuclear scientist. He gets some of this material from eBay, I think, and sets it on fire, producing thousands and thousands of what he thought were sparks, but which he knew better, actually. These are molten iron droplets. Why do we get spherical droplets from molten materials? Well, when a liquid is aerosolized, it forms itself by surface tension into droplets. Could that be what explains the tops of these toasted cars around the World Trade Center? Liquid molten iron droplets falling everywhere in this very high heat event. What other rational explanation can we find that explains this phenomena? Well, you can also produce in your own backyard with shaped cutter charges this phenomena and break and take down steel structures in the process, like John Cole did, a civil engineer. And cutting most of the time in his experiments cleanly through the steel beam. Well, you don't have to make your own cutter charges. You can get them. They've been invented. In fact, thermite-based cutter charges before 9/11, projecting thermite charge particle streams, molten iron, on the order of hundreds of milliseconds, much more effective at cutting through much greater thicknesses of steel structural members, which is very, very helpful, but very expensive. Well, why would we have the perpetrators of 9/11 choosing to use thermite-based cutter charges rather than high-energy explosives like C4 and RDX? Well, those provide very loud bangs and very bright flashes, audio and visual signatures that surely the perpetrators would have wanted to avoid. It'd be an obvious controlled demolition then. Well, it was pretty obvious, as you're seeing in these webinars, but this perhaps was they were hoping by this choice to be less obvious. Well, even the casings of similar devices have been patented with consumable consolidated thermite, meaning nothing left behind. No casings, just pools of molten iron. Fascinating, huh? Well, is there any evidence of unignited thermite? That was all evidence of ignited thermite in the World Trade Center. How about unignited? What was found in the dust by this team of international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen? They find in their 8 collected samples, I think it's 7, independently collected samples, like this one in Jeanette McKinley's apartment across the street from the South Tower on Liberty Street. Her windows blew in from the explosions that we'll get into next week and the week following in this 3-part series. They filling her apartment full of this toxic dust. And she was a artist, so she used this material in her therapy, actually, with her artwork, because it was so traumatic. I mean, she was in her apartment when this happened. And she paid for that decision with her life. She succumbed to brain cancer. But hers is one of these 4 samples. All the samples, the team of scientists find these curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They thought they were paint, but they're attracted to a magnet. So they have this high iron content, right? They get real curious and do a X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy and find, yet again, the ingredients of thermite, unignited iron oxide and aluminum. And they get real curious now, zoom in 50,000 times with a nuclear microscope, and they find iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets, the ingredients of thermite, at 1,000 times smaller particle size than the diameter of a human hair. These are at a nanoscale. These are nano-engineered materials. They're set in a matrix, a bed of organic material, oxygen, silica, carbon. These are the materials that are used in TNT for expansion. So apparently there is an effort here to take the materials of an incendiary, which works by means of heat, extreme heat, 4,000 degrees heat usually, and engineer it to become more explosive with these organic materials. Well, at about 758 degrees Celsius, 758 degrees Fahrenheit, these 4 samples that they ended up documenting so thoroughly in this peer-reviewed paper, which we'll get into, they ignite, showing that they're energetic materials like thermite, not normal materials. Paint doesn't do this. When they ignite, they produce what? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature, iron, aluminum, etc., as the molten iron microspheres found in the World Trade Center dust by all of these other agencies. So we know where those iron microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips. As if we didn't know, because they're found attached to these partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, we have an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data that could be used for very effectively in a court of law to prosecute the real perpetrators of 9/11. See, this stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. When you get these materials down in size at the nanoscale, the surface volume increases exponentially. So you have an engineered incendiary to become more explosive due to the very fast chemical reaction. It's made not in a garage. Don't try this at home. So we know where to find the people who make this material, where there's the political will to pursue it, which we've been waiting for since 2009 when this paper came out. A 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. The red layer that's been discovered as active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. It's a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material, concludes this team of 8 international researchers. That is evidence added to all the evidence that we've been looking at is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. The fires cause less robust structures to collapse, but again, they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance. Why haven't we had a collapse of a protected steel frame skyscraper by fire ever? Well, one reason is the steel conducts that heat away. So the steel never gets this because it's so dense. So it never reaches its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which steel loses half of its holding capability and can begin to bend. But to keep that from ever happening, we coat steel with cementitious fireproofing these days. 2 hours on the beams and 3 hours on the columns to give not only the occupants time to get out, but the firefighters time to put out the fire altogether. But even so, again, 20 minutes or 30 minutes is the maximum time a fire can even be in these buildings. This is 4 to 6 times as much fireproofing as is ever needed. We also keep the contractors from building these buildings out of combustible materials like wood, and we keep the tenants from bringing in materials that exceed certain flammability standards. So we also, just to keep any of the fire from ever becoming a problem, we sprinkler these buildings. So there's a level of redundancy here that is absolutely exceptional, and the reason that we have not lost one of these steel frame protected structures in history of thousands of these buildings. So the official reports began with FEMA, which had limited funding, $600,000, really a joke. And even so, their efforts were hampered. They didn't have access to the blueprints of the buildings, adequate access to the site, access to the public for photographs and videos. It was a joke, documented by the New York Times. So NIST takes over and produces their final report 6 years later, and began with the conclusion that fires caused the collapse. They weren't trying to find out how the building collapsed. They were trying to find out how fire produced this collapse. That's not the scientific method. Even though they acknowledge in 2006, we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7. Yeah, we bet you did. And what did they do with the FEMA report? Again, they 86'd it. They omitted it from their final report altogether. And in that report from FEMA, they acknowledged at least that further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue of how the building collapsed. And surely in the most puzzling, largest structural failures in history, we have the preservation of the evidence, the steel, key evidence. But no, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, 400 truckloads a day were carted out of the World Trade Center, beginning with Building 7, and sent to China for recycling before investigators could get their hands on it and do an adequate investigation. This is the destruction of evidence in a crime scene. They called it an act of war, so they weren't bound, apparently, by the rules of crime scene investigation. Prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately but it didn't, prompting experts like Danny Jawenko to make their obvious conclusions.
Danny Jawenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten, zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
And Hugo Bachmann, chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering at Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. In my opinion, the building World Trade Center 7 was, with great probability, professionally demolished. And one of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth, like Kamal Obaid from UC Berkeley with his master's, and a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards. He's had his own structural engineering firm for decades now, without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. What does that sound like? A natural collapse? No. Which is why we had one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Hulsey, former chair of the Civil Engineering Department at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, take on the job that NIST failed so miserably at, as we've seen, to find out what really could have or couldn't have brought this building down. So he models it very carefully, but first finding what the problem is. No other tall steel frame building had ever failed due to fire, he said. Ensuring public safety is really important. The failure mechanism must be understood. He and his team of PhD researchers start first with to examine the response to the fire loads, the results of concrete and steel when they're heated with fires. Second, rule out scenarios that could not cause the collapse. And third, identify the types of failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. Uses all the same input data that NIST did, finding in the process that NIST falsified much of their input data, but nevertheless uses in his analysis the same input data so that they could compare apples to apples. So even with the flawed input data, in seeking to simulate structural responses due to the fires in floors 13 and below, as NIST did, they examined the NIST collapse initiation hypothesis, and then they simulated numerous fire scenarios to identify what could lead to the collapse. Well, first putting all of this in AutoCAD and then advancing this in two separate parallel paths, one with the Abacus software, very sophisticated software, and one with SAP 2000. They study the area that NIST claimed to be the cause of the initiation of the collapse, as we talked about. Finding what we talked about in the process here, the stiffeners were omitted by NIST. They find that the girder couldn't even have slid off its seat, which we didn't mention before, because it would have been trapped by the side plate welded onto the side of this wide flange beam after that girder expanded due to the same heat that was expanding the long span beams in there. And they ignore, the UAF finds that, yeah, they did ignore the shear studs that the shop drawings show were on the structure and the steel beam stiffeners, as we mentioned. They also find that, indeed, there's 10 times less force in the dynamic impact of the 13th floor onto the 12th. So there couldn't have been a progressive failure, as NIST claims, at all. They also found that the movement of the steel and concrete in this area as a result of the fires would have moved out of and pushing the exterior wall out. But NIST made this exterior wall infinitely stiff, so it couldn't move out, which is, again, fraudulent. So they got the movement forced to the inside, NIST did, as a result. So the key findings in this 4-year, $300,000 study is that NIST overestimated the exterior wall rigidity. Those exterior walls were more flexible. And they found that the movement was in the opposite direction, as NIST claimed, as we just discussed. They found that the shear connections were not broken, as NIST claims, from the beams, long span steel beams up to the concrete floor. It's a composite connection, and the shear studs wouldn't have been broken. Neither would the bolts that fastened girder A2001 to its seat. They wouldn't have been broken. In other words, no collapse, just on the base of this. Well, they found that columns 79, 80, and 81 did not fail under the same conditions that NIST modeled them. They found that if they did fail, because they modeled that also, it could lead to failure. But then the building would tip, as you see here. This is what would have happened if in the UAF model, if they forced those columns that NIST say failed to fail. The building, of course, tips, which is what you'd expect because of the asymmetry of the building and the asymmetry of the failed columns relative to all the other columns. What did they find? That the collapse of this building was a global failure, not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns. When NIST models it, in order to get the failure to occur, like the videos show, we have to have a global failure. In other words, it didn't experience a progressive collapse, but a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns. Fire did not cause the collapse of Building 7, therefore. The temperature was not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and the girders. Comparing the UAF model on the left to the actual collapse of the building, you find that it mimics it relatively perfectly compared to NIST's model on the right, which doesn't even come close to modeling anything that looks like the actual collapse of Building 7 in the videos. Do we have foreknowledge of this building's collapse? Because if it was a planned event, people would know about it. Well, let's look at this interesting predicament that Chief Hayden finds himself in. He goes to this engineer, says, if we allow it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse? How soon? Well, in its current state, you have about 5 hours. What? For the first time in history, a steel frame building has never collapsed due to fire. But this one's going to collapse in 5 hours due to those small fires that you saw. Can we have the name of this engineer? No, he's anonymous. The prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge. Like these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera, saying this.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame, debris coming down.
The building is about to blow up, flame and debris coming down. How do they know this building is about to blow up? It has a few small scattered fires in it. Well, what did this gentleman hear on the radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker seconds before he talked to us already earlier about the explosions in the building? Everybody was held back. Here's what he hears on that radio.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Wait a minute. Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? How precise does that have to be? Is anybody buying this? Well, they've been buying it for almost 20 years now. Because of the reporting. But some of the reporting, let's some of the truth slip through, like this piece from the BBC.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. The building is still standing. It doesn't come down for another 20 minutes, and yet they even have the reason for its collapse. They apologize for this error, citing the confusing events of the day. But does this make them psychic? What's really going on here? Well, CNN does a much better job than that. They announce the collapse of the building at 11:07 that morning, 6 hours before it comes down.
In New York, Alan Dobbs-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
And just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sadka and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash and building material.
Wow. Had that building come down, hold on one second. At that time, it would have been, the videos of it would have been completely obscured by the massive dust clouds that just blanketed Lower Manhattan. We wouldn't have any videos of it. Was it supposed to come down at that time? And were those suspicious construction workers fixing a dud that didn't go down at that time? And they're not rescue workers, first responders. They're not firefighters. That's what some researchers speculate, is that it was a dud. It was supposed to go down with the Trade Center tower, so it could be blamed on the destruction of the World Trade Center. But while we're speculating, the Twin Towers, let's speculate about what this gentleman who owned Building 7 and built it in the 80s and then secured the Twin Towers 6 weeks prior to their demise. Watch what he says on PBS a year later after 9/11.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Let's break this down a little bit. The smartest thing to do is pull it. Well, that's a term used in the controlled demolition industry. They made the decision to pull. Well, firefighters don't make a decision to pull a building. This whole thing is screwed up. And then we watch the building collapse. They say, oh, I didn't mean pull the building. I meant pull the firefighters out of the building. Well, the firefighters were not in the building to pull out. They were told not to fight the fire. They were told it had structural damage, that it was going to come down, which is why everybody was expecting the building to come down. So no firefighting operations were taken by FDNY. Well, with our use of the scientific method, what do you think, having looked at the evidence that's been omitted from the mainstream media and then by NIST and our government officials and academic universities too, by the way, which we're trying to penetrate with the Halsey study now and wake people up in academia who swallowed the official story hook, line, and sinker from NIST. But for you who are doing critical thinking and looking at evidence for perhaps the first time, did this building come down by fire or did it come down by controlled demolition? That's a very important question, because if you're convinced, like we are, that the evidence shows with these 10 key characteristic features, direct evidence of explosives, and fire not creating any of these features, let alone all of them, and with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony that you find this proof of controlled demolition, then you have a huge problem, like I did when I became aware of this evidence in 2006. You might just find yourself on a mission to wake people up, because look at what happened after 9/11. The world changed. A $6.5 trillion global war on terror. Our civil liberties under attack by the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act of 2012, and the other executive orders and so forth. Any of us can be arrested without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury. We can be held indefinitely. We can even be tortured and assassinated. That was all legal. I say legal. It's unconstitutional, certainly, but that's what they're doing because of 9/11. So it's relevant today. Your grandchildren will be paying for the 9/11 wars, which are still going on, the longest war in history in Afghanistan and Iraq. So think clearly about it and decide what you're going to do. And write us some questions. Andy, I think we might have some questions already, maybe, and maybe there's some more. How do they do that?
Absolutely. The best way to go ahead and submit your questions is go to ae911truth.org, go up to continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see a box to send them in, and I'll be looking for more of them in the next few minutes here. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed you agree this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Thank you. And that makes sense to me. While you're there, you guys subscribe to our newsletter. You know, once or twice a month or more, sometimes we send out information, that the latest evidence that we're collecting, the latest efforts we're making toward getting a real investigation and the progress. So all very important for you to spend a couple of minutes, put your name and email on our website get informed with our very extensive body of evidence on the website as well, ae911truth.org, and sign the petition. If you're an architect or engineer, especially, we have 3,400 now, but you can also support them. We have 20,000 others. So please make a stand and donate. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have projects all over the place, making films like Seven, which I meant to tell you about. I didn't see that slide. Oh, it's coming up. And we have all kinds of projects educating architects, engineers, the academic institutions and professions, the media, and the government officials. Lots and lots of work. So donate and become a member. Join the family of sustaining supporters that keep us enabling ourselves to persevere in these legal efforts that I'll show you about, for instance, until we break through with 9/11. So become a member. And if you can't do any of that, at least volunteer with us. If you have some time. Andy, what are some of the things people can do?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And with volunteering, it's not something that you have to do full time. You can come and go and put in whatever time that you can. And the first step, of course, is to fill out the form. We have a form at ae911truth.org. It's the easiest application you'll ever fill out, just some basic info so we can get in touch with you. And then how you help out, it depends largely on you and what your skill set is and what you feel comfortable doing. We can have you calling people on the phone. We can have you doing research behind the scenes. And of course, if you've got kind of specialized talents, we're always interested in those. But the most important thing is have that spark in you, the willingness to do something that will make the world a better place. And I'm not just putting out empty bluster there and saying that I really do think that it does make the world a better place. And a common theme I've been saying, I said on my show this week, I'll say it here on the webinar, you never know how your outreach is going to impact other people. I mean, I woke up to this because somebody put a video where they shouldn't have. I'm glad that they did, but I was expecting to find something else, and it was all about 9/11. Now look at the work that I'm doing now. You can have that kind of impact just from the simplest actions. So please get involved if you're considering it, and we can make some important history together.
Right on. And that's where you go on the website, as Andy mentioned. And here's some of the things you can do. And if you like to work alone, you can do that too. Contact your local elected representatives, the media representatives, architects and engineers. Tell everyone you know. Screen the DVDs. I'll show you an example of one in a second here. And share them with architects, engineers. The brochures, that is, you can get 100 of them for $10, and they look kind of like this. And you can hand them out on the street. What you're not being told about 9/11. We also have a brochure called Rethink 9/11. The evidence might surprise you. And you can actually download the 135-page finite element modeling that we just talked about and hand it to architects and structural engineers and others. This is evidence that NIST is completely fraudulent. Show the Building 7 movie called Seven, and which has just been released. Soon we'll have the DVD available, but you can watch it by renting or buying it online at Amazon Prime. So soon that'll be free in a month on Amazon Prime too. But take advantage of that movie, 45 minutes, created by Dylan Avery, director of Loose Change, 9/11. And know that we have submitted a request for correction to NIST, citing the 8 of the key fraudulent points. been discussing so many of them. And they've written back and saying, no, thank you. We like what we did. Well, they didn't give detailed responses that answered any of the questions that we raised. So we have now appealed that decision, and we're anticipating imminent answers from that. And we have something we put together here at AE 911 Truth that will be the perfect tip of the spear. Andy, you want to talk about this one?
That's right. It's the Bobby Mcelveen World Trade Center Investigation Act. It's named after Bobby Mcelveen, who lost his life entering the North Tower lobby on September 11th. He was killed by an explosion, according to the coroner that his father, Bob Mcelveen, spoke to. So right there, we have a chance to talk to our congressman about some aspect of the official story that doesn't measure up. Or a detail that doesn't match up to the official story, I should say, rather. And there's so many of them that Richard has outlined. So what this would do is this would create a select committee. It can be passed in either House of Congress to look into the evidence of controlled demolition on September 11th. It's written in such a way that they actually have to look into this specific evidence and give it, it's a fair day in court. It's fair day in Congress. But as I think our very battle-hardened audience knows at this point, Congress doesn't do anything unless they hear from a lot of their constituents. So that's why you have to get involved. Even if you've reached out to members of Congress before, the key is not having one meeting, it's having several, letting them know that you're out there and that your coalition is building. So you got to be that activist and keep in constant communication with them. And we will help you do that. If you want to set up a meeting with your member of Congress, and Richard may be talking about this in a few moments here, you can contact us, Congress at ae911truth.org if you're not sure how to do it, and tell them that you want to have a virtual or a phone conference with members of AE 911 Truth and yourself and your congressman's office. It might be a staffer, it might be the congressman himself or congresswoman, but these are very productive, very effective, and it opens the door for us to do the work that we need to do. But you have to open that door because they care more about their constituents than they care about some guys from California, unless they live in that district. So you are the key in this, almost quite literally here. So please go to ae911truth.org/justice and learn more about it.
And we're going to tell them about the grand jury investigation when we get on the phone with your congressman. When you make the appointment, we'll do all the talking for you. You know, it's all virtual now, Zoom and so forth. We've done many of these, and we'll do one for you. So let us know. We're going to tell them that we did give 60 exhibits to the U.S. attorney in Manhattan, and we have submitted a mandamus action lawsuit to force them to show proof that they have indeed given this to a special grand jury, as the law requires them to do and as they agreed to do. And the FBI has been sued by us because they have our evidence. We've given it to them. They've responded to it, and yet they didn't include it in the 2015 9/11 Commission review, which requires them to give all the evidence since the 9/11 Commission report came out. They didn't do it. It becomes public when they do that. And that's why probably they didn't do it. So we've sued them. And so we're in progress with that lawsuit as well. And you should be aware also that 5 fire commissioners from a New York area city have unanimously voted for a resolution demanding a new investigation based on the evidence that we're looking at in these 3-part series. This is part 1 of. He says, you better believe, Christopher Joya, fire commissioner, when the entire fire service of New York is on board, will be an unstoppable force. And that's what we're looking forward to. Speaking of unstoppable, 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts have all gotten together in this documentary, landmark documentary of ours, which reveals what really happened, what's the evidence at the World Trade Center, how these towers came down. Here's just a taste, a couple of minutes.
involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed a petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
No, it wasn't science, which is why we have materials like this DVD for you to take to the media, the government, academicians, professionals, etc. We can't do it alone. We're just a handful of staff at AE 9/11 Truth. We've got to multiply our efforts. So it's incumbent upon you, if you found this information viable, to take that material and the 50-page booklet, Beyond Misinformation, which you can download for free at beyondmisinformation.org, to so many others. You all have to get involved. You can download, you can watch on free on YouTube the classic lecture on this series, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth. You can watch on YouTube for free the 15-minute version of Ed Asner's narrated Building 7 documentary, Solving the Mystery of 7. But I think we might have some questions. Is that right, Andy?
That's right. We got 4 questions today. The first one asks, In the frequently asked questions for Building 7, in question 32, it sounds to me like NIST is saying one of the benefits from their investigation will be that their study will aid the architects and engineers to construct more robust buildings. But then in question 36, NIST says that they must withhold from public release limited and specific input and results files for collapse models used in the World Trade Center 7 study. Is that a contradiction?
It sure is a contradiction, and questions like this, which are just so aptly written by our viewers, need to be collected and sent to NIST, and we need to put a project together to do just that, because they're the ones who have to answer questions like this. NIST can't say on the one hand that they're doing this for architects and engineers and then withhold the computer input data, citing that it might jeopardize public safety. Well, doesn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold this information from the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? Again, if this building came down, there are hundreds of similarly designed buildings that could also come down due to fires. This is huge, but it's crickets out there. And the of all the structural recommendations made by NIST, none of them were incorporated into the International Building Code. The International Conference of Building Officials did not see fit to change their structural sections. What does that tell you? They know that their buildings are safe from airplanes. I mean, they did change some of the egress and fireproofing components, but none of the structural that would keep a building falling at free fall due to a few small office fires. Back to you.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll tell you what, we get a lot of good questions like this. I think it would make their heads explode at NIST if they had to face some of these and pointing out these internal contradictions in their FAQs and in their reports. And I advise people also to send them to NIST, because it's one thing when we do it. I mean, I'm sure they get their defenses up behind the scenes there and try to, protect themselves as much as possible when they see something from us. But if it's coming from everybody, who knows what you might catch them in. So send these questions on to NIST and then forward it to us, because we'd love to see the answers and see how they respond to various people writing into them. I mean, they are a government agency after all. They're supposed to be there for you. This next question. I heard a story that the fire alarm system in Building 7 might have been in maintenance mode, but I don't know if that is true. Do you know what the alarm condition was on 9/11? If it was in maintenance mode, do we know if that condition was restored? And do we know if the sprinklers do not work in a maintenance mode condition?
The sprinklers do not work in maintenance mode condition, and that's one of the reasons that the sprinklers probably failed. What we're told is they failed as a result of the water mains damaged when the Twin Towers fell, which is, a reasonable, intuitively understood reason. But I have heard that the fire alarm system was put in maintenance mode, and I don't have evidence of that. If anybody does or can find it, let's get on it, because I'd like to include it. I think it's important. It doesn't prove how the towers came down like we've been proving, but it's additional information that helps paint a picture of intent here. Andy?
Yeah, I have nothing really much to add, but it doesn't even get into the physics of the fact that this building fell at free fall as it came down. So regardless of sprinklers or no sprinklers, the building shouldn't have fallen that way. All right, this next one is from YouTube, and the person actually opened up the chat conversation saying, "What is the solution?" That's what I believe we should be discussing. And yes, the 9/11 Truth Movement needs to be discussing solutions. I absolutely agree. I mean, we have to continue educating the public because we always want to bring on new people, especially during times when people are questioning more and more the world that they live in. But yeah, solutions are great. So, I mean, my solution is to keep on doing the stuff that we are doing. And I may have said this earlier in the broadcast. If I did, I forgot. But whatever you do, you have no idea how it's impacting others. And unfortunately, we don't get to see that. It's not like a video game where you get an immediate response. You do this thing and then you get some screen that pops up and says, congratulations, this happened as a result of it. Sometimes you don't know, and you just got to have faith that you're reaching people, no matter how much they try to shadow ban you, no matter how much they try to mess with your view counts. If you make a YouTube video, you got to just trust that it's getting out there, and then who knows how far it reaches. So absolutely meet with your member of Congress, and it's a collective effort. I remember when I first started doing this back in the day, I really thought I was going to be a lonely voice out there. I mean, I'd see people like Richard and stuff out on YouTube, but I would go out into MySpace. I figured I was going to be the only person doing this, and it was like a miracle moment, a movie, when I discovered like entire communities of people who had the exact same idea that I had. It was so relieving and assuring, and we got a lot of things done collectively through social media and street action and those kinds of things. So every little bit counts, and you got to consider yourself as part of a bigger army in an information war to get the stuff out there. And even if they don't want to acknowledge it on TV, I mean, how much respect and prestige does the mainstream media have anymore? Even if they don't put it on the front page of the New York Times, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. So you can still get your message out and have a huge impact just by doing those things, meeting with your members of Congress, and trying to get the message out in whatever way you can. Just like we did with C-SPAN too. You just find a chink in the armor somewhere to slip it in. And as long as it's not illegal, then you're good. So that's my thought. Richard?
And support our efforts, our legal efforts. We expect to have results in all of our legal efforts, the grand jury petition, the FBI lawsuit, and the inquest, which I didn't even mention, where Matt Campbell is suing for a new inquest into his brother's death. Jeff was murdered on the 106th floor of the North Tower. And they said it was due to the airplane striking the towers. Well, no, and the fires that brought them down. It wasn't that. It was explosions. And we have ample evidence coming up in the next 2 weeks on this series that you'll see makes that dramatically clear. So that is being presented this month to by one of the top attorneys in London, who's a coroner himself, which is great, to the Attorney General in the UK. So very, very exciting opportunities coming up there as well. So join us in one way or another. We talked about many solutions in the last 15 minutes alone.
All right, last question of the day here says, would you agree that the free fall acceleration of World Trade Center 7 for 2.25 seconds, according to NIST, and 2.5 seconds, according to David Chandler, globally, symmetrically, and against the path of most resistance, is the single most important piece of prima facie evidence for the controlled demolition of World Trade Center 7, and that 9/11 was an inside job, WTC 7 being such a secure building?
Yeah, if Building 7 came down by controlled demolition, and if that can be proven, which we just did to you, then it casts grave doubt on the rest of the World Trade Center destruction, which casts grave doubt on the entire plot of 9/11, all 4 flights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, Pentagon, Shanksville. You just have to do more research, which is outside the area of our expertise, but within the area of the expertise of many who have gone into these subjects, and found that it is all fraudulent, designed to manipulate the American people into supporting foreign wars and a $48 billion increase in the Pentagon budget, enriching the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry, the media, all of which industries actually are controlling just the 5 corporations that own 95% of the mainstream media in this country. So you should be bothered by that fact alone. But yes, the free fall acceleration is absolutely key. Is it the most key? It is for some people. For others, it's the evidence of thermite incendiaries in the World Trade Center dust. You know, some people don't get free fall. It's this mysterious thing, but people do get incendiaries and the evidence of explosives in the towers, which we'll be going into in depth 1 week from today. So if you're, I hope you join us because I want you to come back for part 2, which is coming up at 1 p.m. a week from today, Pacific time, where we go into the Twin Towers, the overview, the explosions, the sudden near free fall collapse, the high velocity lateral ejections, the shattering in the steel frame, the midair pulverization of concrete. And the week after that, we get into the extreme heat associated with the Twin Towers, high-rise fires, what they can and can't do, pyroclastic-like clouds, not from high-rise fires, molten steel and iron, not from high-rise fires, iron microspheres, we get into more depth on those, not from high-rise fires, thermite, nanothermite, not from high-rise fires, but capable of bringing these buildings down. And we show you how that could be the only rational hypothesis, one that was, of course, never, ever considered by NIST. So join us then. And thanks, Andy, for helping us out so much. And thanks, everybody. We'll catch up with you in a week. Until then,